Welcome to Night Owl Podcast History, where we wander through the shadows of the past, gently unwrapping the stories that shaped our world. Tonight, we embark on a journey into the world of Byzantium, a realm that carried the torch of Rome long after the Western Empire crumbled into dust. Now, imagine this. The Western Roman Empire collapses in 476, swept away by waves of invaders, internal decay, and the slow grinding of time. But in the east, a city still gleams, standing proud between two continents. Constantinople, the new Rome, a jewel of walls and domes, refuses to fall. And at the heart of its survival, at the very core of its endurance, lies something far more than marble palaces or bustling markets. It lies in the discipline, the innovation, and the relentless adaptation of its military. Tonight's tale is about that army, the Byzantine military machine, a force that transformed from Roman legions into something far stranger, far more flexible, and in many ways, far more formidable. This was not just an army of swords and shields. It was an institution of survival, a secret weapon that allowed Byzantium to live on for nearly 1,000 years after Rome's western heart stopped beating. If you enjoy drifting into history with me, take a moment to subscribe and like this episode. It is the best way to keep this little midnight community alive, and it means I can keep bringing you more stories week after week. Now settle in, dim the lights, take a breath, and picture the Eastern Roman Empire in the late 5th century. The West has fallen. Vandals rule in Carthage, Goths dominate Italy, Franks carve out kingdoms in Gaul. Europe is changing shape with the ferocity of an earthquake. But in the East, things look different. Constantinople still shines, and its emperors still call themselves Roman. Yet survival was no guarantee. The East faced threats from every horizon. Persians pressing from the east, Slavs creeping from the north, nomadic horsemen sweeping from the steppe, and Arab raiders soon to explode out of the desert. Alone, no city, no emperor could have endured. The answer lay in adaptation. And so the Byzantine military, inheriting the disciplined legacy of the Roman legions, began a centuries-long process of transformation. The Roman legions, with their heavy infantry formations, had once been the backbone of empire. They conquered Gaul, marched through the deserts of the Middle East, and crushed Carthage. But by the 5th century, those same legions had become brittle, weighed down by bureaucracy, slow to move, and hopelessly outdated against swift-moving barbarian cavalry and mounted archers. Byzantium learned this lesson early and painfully. And from those lessons, it built something new. The Byzantine army would never again rely solely on heavy infantry. Instead, it embraced mobility, versatility, and above all, adaptability. Cavalry, once a supporting arm in the Roman world, became the decisive arm of war. The Byzantines developed some of the most sophisticated cavalry in the medieval world, from the Cataphracts, armored like walking fortresses on horseback, to horse archers who could rival the nomads of the steppe. But it was not just about horses and armor. What truly made the Byzantine military extraordinary was its brain. Unlike so many medieval armies, it fought not only with muscle but with calculation. Byzantine generals and emperors understood war as a science, a game of strategy, supply, and subtlety. They wrote military manuals, refined tactics, and studied their enemies. They were masters of defense, ambush, psychological warfare, and even diplomacy masquerading as war. To the Byzantines, a battle won without fighting was as glorious as a battlefield drenched in blood. Consider this for a moment. Most medieval states raised armies when needed, from peasants, mercenaries, or noble levies. But the Byzantines built something more permanent, the tagmata and the themes.
The themes were provincial armies tied to land, a fusion of soldier and farmer designed to defend the empire's borders without exhausting the treasury. The tagmata were the professional elite, the standing forces of Constantinople, the emperor's blade, ready to march wherever the danger was greatest. Together, they formed a system that could stretch across continents and still defend the heartland. As you drift with me into this story, imagine a soldier of the early Byzantine world. He may be a farmer in Anatolia, summoned to defend his land against a Persian raid. He might be a cataphract knight, gleaming in lamellar armor, his horse wrapped in iron, his lance couched like a thunderbolt. He could even be a mercenary, a Varangian Guard from the cold fjords of the north, wielding a great axe in service of the emperor. They were diverse, they were innovative, and above all, they were dedicated to survival. Because make no mistake, for Byzantium, survival was war. Every generation, some new storm threatened to sweep it away. And every generation, the army adapted, changed its skin like a serpent, and struck back. The story of the Byzantine military is the story of an empire that refused to die. When Rome fell in the West, its legions had already become shadows of the forces that had once thundered across the Mediterranean. The disciplined squares of armored infantry that had conquered half the world were no longer the invincible phalanxes of old.
The Germanic tribes who poured into Roman provinces did not fight on Roman terms. They were mobile, ferocious, and far more flexible than the lumbering legions that tried to stop them. Byzantium understood this reality with painful clarity. If the Eastern Empire were to survive, it had to break with tradition, shed the heavy skin of Rome's infantry, and build something sharper, faster, and far more adaptable. And so, in the decades after the Western collapse, the Byzantine army transformed. Infantry remained important, but cavalry began to dominate. The empire invested heavily in mounted troops, creating units that blended Roman discipline with barbarian ferocity. At the center of this transformation stood the Cataphracts. Imagine them, men and horses alike covered in lamellar plates, advancing like an iron tide. Their long contos lances could shatter enemy formations, and when they charged in unison, the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath them. Unlike the clumsy cavalry of the West, these men were trained professionals, drilled and disciplined, the product of a state that knew survival depended on precision. But cataphracts were not the only answer. The Byzantines knew that against nimble enemies, like the Persians or the nomads of the steppe, armored knights alone would not suffice. And so they borrowed tactics from their foes. Horse archers became a staple of the army, equipped with composite bows that could pierce armor and strike with deadly speed. From the Huns, the Byzantines learned the art of feigned retreat, luring enemies into traps. From the Persians, they adopted heavy cavalry techniques. From the Slavs and Avars, they learned ambush warfare in forests and marshes. Byzantium was never too proud to copy. It was a sponge, absorbing and refining every weapon its enemies used against it. This openness to innovation is one of the secrets of Byzantine endurance. While kingdoms in the West clung to outdated traditions, Byzantium reinvented itself again and again. Manuals such as the Strategikon, attributed to Emperor Maurice in the late 6th century, codified this knowledge. The Strategikon is no dry relic. It reads like a field guide for survival. It advises commanders not just on formations and logistics, but on understanding the psychology of enemies. Facing the Persians, expect discipline and reliance on armored cavalry. Facing nomads, beware sudden ambushes and counter with flexible units. Facing Slavs, prepare for night raids and attacks in difficult terrain. It was not just a manual of war, it was a philosophy of adaptation. Let us step into the boots of a Byzantine soldier in the 6th century. Perhaps he is stationed in the east, near the borders of the Persian Empire. For generations, the Romans and Persians have been locked in a duel across Mesopotamia and Armenia. Fortresses dot the landscape, armies march and countermarch, but decisive victory is elusive. Here, our soldier might find himself on campaign under Emperor Justinian, who dreamed of reconquering the lost lands of the West while holding the Persians at bay. He would learn quickly that Byzantine warfare was as much about patience as it was about combat. Battles were rare, often avoided unless victory seemed certain. More often, wars were fought through raids, sieges, and calculated maneuvers designed to exhaust the enemy. Byzantine generals did not measure success only in victories. They measured it in survival. A campaign that ended without defeat was often considered a triumph. This cautious approach frustrated enemies who expected decisive battles, but it kept the empire alive through centuries when others fell. Consider the wars against the Sassanid Persians. These were no mere border skirmishes. They were epic struggles between two superpowers. In 530, at the Battle of Dara, the Byzantines under the general Belisarius faced a Persian army that outnumbered them. Instead of relying on brute force, Belisarius relied on cunning. He dug trenches across the battlefield, funneling the Persian cavalry into narrow lanes where his cataphracts could smash them. At the same time, his infantry and archers poured fire into the enemy from behind cover. It was a masterclass in hybrid tactics, blending Roman engineering, Persian-style cavalry, and the flexibility of a commander who thought more like a chess player than a brawler. Dara was one of the great Byzantine victories, and it showed the world that the heirs of Rome were far from finished. But victories were never permanent. For every triumph, there were setbacks. In 531, at Callinicum, Belisarius faced the Persians again, and this time his army was battered, forced to retreat. Yet, even in defeat, the Byzantines clung to their discipline, withdrawing in order rather than collapsing in chaos. That was the essence of their survival. They did not always win, but they almost always endured. Meanwhile, new dangers brewed in the north. Slavs, Bulgars, and Avars poured into the Balkans, testing the empire's defenses. These enemies were unlike the Persians. They fought not in neat formations, but in sudden raids, striking villages, burning crops, and vanishing into forests. To counter them, Byzantium had to adapt yet again. Garrisons were fortified, border defenses reorganized, and soldiers trained in ambush tactics. The empire developed the theme system, in which soldiers were granted land in exchange for service. This system ensured that frontier provinces could defend themselves, reducing the need for constant deployments from Constantinople. It was not perfect, but it gave the empire resilience against wave after wave of invasion. Picture for a moment the Balkan frontier in the 7th century. A small Byzantine village lies on a hillside, its people tending fields that double as training grounds for militia. When word comes of a raid, these farmers take up arms, not as ragged levies, but as soldiers with real training and a stake in the defense of their land. Behind them looms a fortress, stocked with supplies, ready to withstand a siege. This was not the Rome of old, with professional legions marching endlessly across the world. This was a new kind of empire, decentralized, hardened, and capable of absorbing punishment without collapsing. It is here that we see the genius of Byzantine military organization. The empire did not try to fight wars as if it still ruled the world. It accepted its limits, economized its strength, and invested in systems that could stretch across centuries. And through it all, Constantinople itself remained the beating heart of the empire. The city was more than a capital, it was the ultimate fortress. Its triple walls, stretching across the land walls of Theodosius, were the envy of the world. No barbarian horde, no Persian army, no Slavic raiders could hope to breach them without immense effort. For centuries, these walls stood unbroken, a silent partner to the army in ensuring survival.
Even when defeats rocked the provinces, Constantinople's walls gave the empire time to recover, to regroup, to endure. As night deepens, imagine those walls glowing with torchlight, while in the barracks beyond, soldiers of every origin, Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, even Germanic mercenaries, prepared their arms. They were the shield of the empire, a strange, diverse, ever-changing shield, but a shield nonetheless.
And as long as that shield held, Byzantium would live on. By the middle of the 6th century, Byzantium stood at a crossroads. The empire had survived the collapse of Rome in the west, endured the relentless assaults of Persians and barbarians, and stabilized its frontiers through reforms in both army and administration. Yet for one ambitious man, mere survival was not enough. That man was Justinian I, crowned emperor in 527, who looked out from his palace across the Bosporus and dreamed not of survival, but of glory. Justinian was not content to preside over an eastern fragment of Rome. He wanted Rome itself restored, its lands reconquered, its legacy renewed. He believed he was destined to be the emperor who would reunite the Mediterranean world under the banner of the double-headed eagle. But dreams alone do not build empires. They require armies, generals, and strategy. And for this, Justinian turned to one of the greatest commanders in history, Belisarius. Belisarius was young, brilliant, and utterly loyal. He had already proven his skill in the east against the Persians, most famously at Dara, where his cunning use of trenches and disciplined cavalry had delivered victory against a larger foe. But under Justinian, Belisarius would be given tasks that seemed impossible. To reconquer the shattered provinces of the west, where barbarian kingdoms had risen on Rome's ruins. The first target was North Africa, ruled by the Vandals. Once, the Vandals had been Rome's terror, sacking the Eternal City in 455 and establishing a kingdom around Carthage. But by Justinian's time, their power had waned. Still, the idea of sailing an army across the Mediterranean to overthrow a kingdom was audacious. Many doubted it could be done. But in 533, Belisarius set out with a force of around 15,000 men, hardly more than a large expedition compared to the vast armies of old Rome. This army was no simple legion. It was a carefully balanced mix of Byzantine strength. There were cataphracts, armored cavalry that could smash through enemy lines, horse archers who could harass and outmaneuver, infantry with shields and spears drilled in Roman discipline, and mercenaries from faraway lands bringing their own fighting styles into the blend. The army sailed in hundreds of ships, guarded by the Byzantine navy, another critical tool of imperial power. When Belisarius landed in North Africa, he advanced with caution, ensuring that his men respected local civilians and discipline was tight. The Vandals, overconfident and disorganized, met him at Decumum near Carthage. The battle was fierce, but Belisarius's discipline and tactical brilliance turned the tide. He divided his forces, lured the Vandals into fragmented attacks, and then unleashed his cavalry to smash them piecemeal. Within days, Carthage itself was in his hands. The campaign did not end there. At Tricomarum, Belisarius faced the Vandals again, and once more, discipline triumphed over chaos. By early 534, the Vandal kingdom, once a scourge of Rome, was gone, erased in a matter of months. North Africa was returned to imperial rule, and Justinian could boast that one of Rome's lost provinces had been restored. The success was astonishing, but it was only the beginning. Justinian's eyes now turned to Italy, where the Ostrogoths had carved out a kingdom after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Italy was Rome's heart, its symbolic soul, and Justinian could not claim to be the true restorer of empire without it. In 535, Belisarius led his army into Italy. His campaign was not one of sweeping conquests, but of grinding sieges and clever maneuvers. At first, victories came quickly. Sicily was secured with little resistance. Naples fell after a daring infiltration through an aqueduct. Rome itself, abandoned by the Goths, was occupied by Belisarius's forces. But holding Rome was another matter. In 537, the Goths laid siege to the Eternal City, surrounding it with a vast host. For more than a year, Belisarius and his men endured hunger, disease, and constant assault. The Goths cut aqueducts, trying to starve the city into submission. Yet Belisarius, with iron resolve, held firm. He manned the walls, organized sallies, and maintained morale, while the city's citizens looked to him as their defender. The siege of Rome became a symbol of Byzantine resilience. Even when vastly outnumbered, discipline and ingenuity prevailed. Belisarius's cavalry harassed the Goths outside the walls, while his archers inflicted heavy losses from the ramparts. Eventually, the Goths withdrew, unable to break the city's defenses. Rome, though battered and diminished, remained in imperial hands. The Gothic War dragged on for nearly 2 decades, marked by victories and reversals, betrayals and negotiations. Belisarius was recalled and sent back multiple times, while other generals continued the struggle. It was not until the 550s, under the general Narses, that the Goths were decisively defeated at Taginae and Mons Lactarius, ending their kingdom and restoring Italy to Byzantine control. Justinian's vision had come closer to reality. The empire once again stretched across North Africa, Italy, and parts of Spain, where Byzantine forces had also gained a foothold. The Mediterranean, which had seemed forever lost to barbarian kingdoms, was once again, in large part, a Roman lake. Yet these conquests came at a terrible cost. The wars drained the treasury, strained the army, and left Italy devastated. Cities lay in ruins, populations were scattered, and plague swept through the empire in the 540s, killing countless thousands, including soldiers desperately needed at the front. For all its brilliance, Justinian's reconquest was built on fragile foundations. Still, in military terms, it was a triumph of organization, adaptability, and leadership. How could an empire, seemingly weaker and smaller than Rome had been, accomplish what had seemed impossible? The answer lies once again in the Byzantine military system. Unlike the lumbering legions of old, the Byzantine army was lean, versatile, and capable of operating in hostile territory for long periods. Its commanders valued cunning over brute force. Its soldiers were trained not just to fight, but to endure, to siege, to raid, to hold out against impossible odds. Belisarius embodied this spirit. He was not a conqueror who relied on sheer numbers. He was a master of maneuver, deception, and psychology. He respected discipline above all. In North Africa, he forbade his men from looting civilians, knowing that winning local support was as important as battlefield success. In Italy, he defended cities with patience, never letting despair overwhelm him. He was, in many ways, the model of the Byzantine way of war, clever, cautious, but capable of lightning brilliance when opportunity struck. Imagine for a moment being a soldier in Belisarius's army. You are not one of tens of thousands in an endless legion. You are part of a smaller, tighter, more professional force. You march not in straight lines across paved Roman roads, but through rugged mountains, across hostile deserts, or along crumbling aqueducts. You fight not only with your sword, but with your wits, because your commanders demand flexibility.
One day you may defend a wall, the next you may ride as cavalry, the next you may dig trenches to shape the battlefield. You are, in every sense, a soldier of survival. By the time Justinian died in 565, the Byzantine Empire was larger than it had been in centuries. It had reclaimed the old Roman provinces of the West, humbled its enemies, and stood as the dominant power of the Mediterranean. Yet, beneath this glittering surface lay the cracks of exhaustion. The army had performed miracles, but it could not forever sustain wars on multiple fronts. The Persians still loomed in the east. The Slavs pressed in from the Balkans. And new storms were brewing on the horizon, storms that no one in Justinian's time could have foreseen. For now, though, Byzantium could stand tall. Its armies had proven that Rome's heirs were not only survivors, but warriors capable of reshaping history itself. The death of Justinian in 565 left the Byzantine Empire larger than it had been in centuries, but also dangerously overstretched. The dream of reconquest had been achieved at staggering cost. Provinces reclaimed, but scarred. Cities won, but depopulated. Treasuries drained to their lowest reserves. The army, that marvelous instrument of strategy and survival, had been tested to its very limits. And yet, the greatest challenges still lay ahead. In the east, the empire's ancient rival, the Sassanid Persians, continued to press against Byzantine borders. For centuries, Rome and Persia had fought like titans, neither able to destroy the other, both locked in an endless cycle of war, truce, and uneasy peace. By the early 7th century, this struggle would erupt into one of the most devastating wars of antiquity, a conflict so consuming that it would leave both empires exhausted, gasping for breath, and fatally weakened before the rise of a new, unexpected power. That war began in 602, when internal strife tore through Byzantium. Emperor Maurice, who had tried to stabilize the empire, was overthrown and executed by a usurper named Phocas. His murder enraged the Persian king Khosrow II, who claimed Maurice had been his ally. Using this as pretext, Khosrow unleashed his armies against Byzantium. What began as border raids quickly escalated into full-scale invasion. The Persians struck deep into Byzantine territory, sweeping across Mesopotamia, Syria, and Palestine. City after city fell. Jerusalem itself was captured in 614, its churches desecrated, its relics carried away, including the true cross. In Egypt, the granary of the empire, Persian armies advanced through the Nile Valley, seizing Alexandria and cutting off the breadbasket that had fed Constantinople for centuries. By the 620s, the empire seemed on the verge of collapse. For the Byzantine army, these were years of despair. Garrisons were overwhelmed, provincial defenses shattered, and even the capital itself was threatened. Soldiers who once marched proudly under the banner of victory now found themselves retreating, regrouping, and struggling to hold even the core of Anatolia. But then came a figure who would turn the tide, Heraclius, who seized power in 610. At first, his reign seemed doomed. He inherited an empire in ruin, its enemies everywhere, its finances in tatters. Yet Heraclius possessed a quality essential to Byzantine survival: resilience. He reorganized the army, raised morale, and restructured the empire's military system. He leaned heavily on the themes, granting land to soldiers in exchange for service, binding them more closely to the defense of their own provinces. He melted church treasures to fund campaigns, appealing to faith as well as necessity. Beginning in 622, Heraclius launched a daring counteroffensive. Instead of remaining on the defensive, he struck deep into Persian territory. His campaigns were audacious, almost reckless, but they revitalized Byzantine morale. Moving quickly through Armenia and Mesopotamia, he struck at the Persians where they least expected it. He forged alliances with Turkic nomads from the steppe, turning old enemies into new allies. His army, lean and hardened, marched swiftly across mountains and deserts, striking like lightning where the Persians thought him least likely to appear. The climax came in 627 at the Battle of Nineveh.
Heraclius led his army against the Persians in a brutal winter campaign. Snow covered the fields, winds howled across the plains, yet the Byzantine army pressed forward. At Nineveh, they clashed in a savage battle that raged for hours. Heraclius himself, according to chroniclers, fought like a warrior king, cutting down Persian champions with his own sword. In the end, the Byzantines triumphed. The Persian army broke, its power shattered. The victory was decisive. Within a year, Khosrow was overthrown and murdered by his own nobles. Peace was signed, and the Persians retreated, returning the conquered lands and the true cross itself to Byzantium. For the first time in generations, the endless duel between Rome and Persia seemed finished. Byzantine had survived, even triumphed, against impossible odds. But survival came at a terrible price. Both empires were drained, their armies depleted, their treasuries empty, their people exhausted by decades of war. And as the Byzantine soldiers returned home, weary but proud, they could not have known that a new storm was rising just beyond the horizon. That storm came from Arabia. In 632, the Prophet Muhammad died, leaving behind a new faith and a united people. Within a few years, the armies of Islam surged forth from the deserts, filled with fervor, energy, and astonishing speed. At first, the Byzantines may have dismissed them as raiders, another wave of nomads to be absorbed or repelled. But these were no ordinary raiders. They were disciplined, driven by belief, and led by commanders of extraordinary skill. The first blows came swiftly. In 636, at the Battle of Yarmouk, the Byzantine army faced the Arab forces in Syria. The Byzantines, commanded by experienced generals and supported by heavy cavalry, outnumbered their foes. Yet the Arabs fought with relentless energy, using mobility and unity of purpose to their advantage. Over several days, the battle swayed back and forth until a sudden sandstorm blinded the Byzantines. The Arabs seized the moment, launching a devastating assault that broke the imperial lines. The Byzantine army collapsed, fleeing in chaos. Syria, once a jewel of the empire, was lost forever. The defeats did not stop there. In rapid succession, the Arabs swept across Palestine, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Cities that had been recovered from the Persians now fell to the new conquerors. Alexandria, Antioch, Damascus, all slipped from Byzantine hands. Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, was gone. For the Byzantine army, this was a nightmare unlike any they had faced. Against the Persians, they had fought equals with similar tactics and resources. Against the nomads of the north, they had adapted through ambush and defense. But the Arab armies combined mobility, unity, and zeal in ways the Byzantines struggled to counter. They could march swiftly across deserts, fight fiercely with both cavalry and infantry, and exploit the exhaustion of an empire already worn thin. And yet, Byzantium did not collapse. Even as provinces fell, Constantinople stood. The city, with its triple walls and impregnable defenses, became the rock on which the Arab tide broke. Twice, in 674-678, and again in 717-718, Arab fleets and armies laid siege to the city, determined to capture the heart of the empire. But the Byzantiums had one more secret weapon: Greek fire, a terrifying incendiary weapon that clung to water and burned with unquenchable fury. Launched from siphons on ships, it turned the sea into a wall of flame, incinerating enemy fleets. The sieges failed. Constantinople endured. The Byzantine army, though battered, had once again adapted. It could not hold every province, but it could hold the core. Anatolia became the empire's fortress, defended by the theme system. Soldiers farmed by day and trained by night, ready to ride out against raiders, to ambush invaders, to bleed the enemy until they withdrew. It was not the empire of Justinian, vast and glittering. It was smaller, humbler, but still alive. And perhaps that was Byzantium's greatest strength. Time and again, its army proved that survival mattered more than glory. Provinces could be lost, victories could be fleeting, but as long as the army endured, as long as Constantinople's walls held, the empire could outlast its enemies. The Arab conquests of the 7th century left the Byzantine Empire reeling. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and much of Mesopotamia were gone forever, absorbed into the rising caliphate. The dream of Justinian's Mediterranean restoration had been shattered, and the empire seemed reduced to a shell of its former self. Yet amid this catastrophe, the Byzantiums found a way to survive. Survival was, after all, their most enduring skill. Out of crisis emerged innovation, and the greatest of these was the theme system, a transformation of the army that would carry the empire through the darkest centuries of its existence. The seeds of this system had already been planted under Emperor Heraclius, but it was in the decades after the Arab invasions that it became the backbone of Byzantine defense. The old model of Roman legions stationed far from home, supplied by massive imperial treasuries, was no longer sustainable. Too many provinces had been lost, too much revenue drained away. The empire needed a new way to maintain soldiers, one that was both economical and resilient. The solution was to tie soldiers directly to the land. Under the theme system, provinces were reorganized into themes, or themata, each governed by a military commander called a strategos. Within each theme, land was granted to soldiers, often small farms sufficient to support a family, in exchange for hereditary military service. These men were farmer soldiers, plowing fields in times of peace and taking up arms in times of war. Their livelihoods were inseparable from the defense of the empire, and because their families depended on their farms, they had a fierce incentive to protect the land. This was not merely a military reform, it was a social revolution. The Byzantine army was no longer an expeditionary force drawn from distant regions. It was woven into the very fabric of local life. Villages became recruiting grounds, farmlands became military reserves, and every border province became a fortress. The empire's survival no longer depended solely on Constantinople's coffers, but on the sweat of its soldiers in the fields of Anatolia and the Balkans. Instead of marching enormous legions across the empire, each theme maintained its own defense. Soldiers could respond quickly to local threats, ambush raiders, and reinforce neighbors. The empire could still concentrate forces when needed, but now it had a decentralized, layered defense that could endure even when the enemy struck deep. And strike deep they did. The Arabs continued their raids across Anatolia, sweeping in to plunder villages before retreating to their bases in Syria. The Bulgars and Slavs pressed from the north, seeking fertile lands in the Balkans. The Avars, fierce nomads of the steppe, launched devastating incursions, sometimes in alliance with Slavic tribes. To face all these enemies at once required more than walls and discipline. It required an army that could fight like a hydra, meeting threats on every front, regenerating strength even as enemies cut into its flesh. One of the first great tests came from the Avars and Slavs in the late 6th and early 7th centuries. They besieged cities, raided deep into the Balkans, and even threatened Constantinople itself. The siege of 626 saw the Avars and Persians joining forces, launching a massive assault on the imperial capital while Heraclius campaigned in the east. The city stood firm, defended by its massive walls and the determination of its people, aided by the miraculous intervention of what chroniclers called the Virgin's protection. This siege became legendary, cementing Constantinople's image as the invincible heart of Byzantium. But the Balkans remained unstable for centuries. Slavic settlers poured into the region, establishing communities in lands that had once been Roman. The Byzantine army responded with a mix of force and diplomacy, sometimes launching punitive campaigns, sometimes absorbing groups into the empire as allies. The goal was not always conquest, but containment. The empire could not afford to bleed itself dry with endless wars. Instead, it learned to balance aggression with pragmatism. The most dangerous northern foe, however, would prove to be the Bulgars. Emerging in the late 7th century, they carved out a powerful state in the Balkans, directly threatening Byzantine control of Thrace and the approaches to Constantinople. Time and again, Byzantine armies marched against them, sometimes victorious, sometimes humiliated. In 680, the Byzantines suffered a disastrous defeat at the Battle of Ongal, where the Bulgar Khan, Asparukh, secured his people's foothold in the Balkans. From then on, the Bulgars became a permanent rival, their horsemen raiding deep into Byzantine lands, their khans negotiating as equals with emperors. For the Byzantine army, this meant decades of grinding warfare, fortifying cities, building defensive lines, and learning once again to adapt. The theme system was crucial in these struggles. When Bulgar cavalry swept across Thrace, local thematic soldiers could mobilize quickly, harassing the raiders, cutting supply lines, and forcing them to retreat. When Arab fleets sailed into the Aegean, the naval themes, established specifically to defend the sea, mustered their ships and fought with the terrifying power of Greek fire. No matter the direction of attack, Byzantium had learned to embed soldiers into every corner of its remaining territory, ensuring that the empire's defenses could bend without breaking. Yet survival was not merely a matter of structure. It was also a matter of spirit. The Byzantine army of this era was hardened by necessity, disciplined by constant war, and motivated by both faith and pragmatism. Soldiers marched into battle under banners bearing the image of Christ, convinced they fought not only for empire, but for God. At the same time, commanders valued guile as much as courage. Ambushes, night raids, and psychological warfare became common tools. Byzantium could not always match its enemies in numbers, but it could outthink them, outlast them, and strike where least expected. Consider the life of a thematic soldier in the 8th century. By day, he tends his fields, sowing grain in the rich soils of Anatolia. His wife and children help with the harvest, their lives bound to the rhythms of the land. But his spear and shield hang ready by the door, his horse tethered nearby. When the stratego sends word of an Arab raid across the border, he gathers with his neighbors, mounting up to ride out. He knows he is not a mercenary fighting for pay. He is defending his home, his village, the land that feeds his family. That bond gave the Byzantium army a resilience no amount of gold could buy. The empire also learned the importance of fortifications. The Balkans and Anatolia became dotted with fortified towns and strongholds, many built or reinforced under imperial orders. These fortresses served as anchors for defense, rallying points for soldiers, and obstacles to raiders. A raiding force could plunder villages, but it could rarely take a fortress without committing to a siege. And sieges bought time for other thematic armies to arrive, time for Constantinople to prepare, time for the empire to endure. By the 9th century, the system had matured. The themes were not only military districts, but engines of survival. They provided soldiers, supplies, and local resilience. They ensured that even in times of disaster, Byzantium could regenerate. And this regeneration would prove vital, for the empire was not destined merely to defend. It was destined to rise again. But before the resurgence, there would be centuries more of struggle, against Arabs in the east, against Bulgars in the north, against internal rebellions and external pressures. The Byzantine army would fight on every frontier, from the deserts of Anatolia to the forests of Thrace, from the Aegean waves to the rugged mountains of Armenia. It would win brilliant victories, suffer crushing defeats, and adapt, always adapt, until the empire itself became synonymous with survival. For now, though,
Picture a twilight scene in the Balkans. A small Byzantine garrison holds a fortress on a hill. Below, the forests stir with the movement of Bulgar horsemen. The soldiers know they are outnumbered, but they do not panic. They light their signal fires, calling nearby themes for aid. They prepare their bows, their stones, their boiling oil. And as the enemy swarms up the slopes, the defenders hold, buying time, defying the darkness. This is the essence of the Byzantine military, not always triumphant, but always unbroken. By the 9th century, the Byzantine Empire had weathered 2 centuries of storm. It had lost vast territories to the Arabs, endured endless raids across Anatolia, fought savage wars with Bulgars in the Balkans, and seen its armies stretched to the breaking point. And yet, the empire endured. Its heart, Constantinople, still beat behind walls no enemy could breach. Its armies, organized through the theme system, had not only survived but hardened, becoming sharper with every generation. Now came a turning point. Under the dynasty of the Macedonian emperors, Byzantium shifted from defense to offense. The army that had learned to endure was about to show that it could also conquer.
From the late 9th into the 10th century, Byzantine armies would march with renewed confidence, reclaiming lands, humiliating enemies, and reshaping the balance of power in the Mediterranean. This renaissance did not happen overnight. It began with careful rebuilding, discipline restored, strategy refined, and resources invested in both land and sea power. By the reign of Basil I, 867 to 886, the empire had stabilized after decades of internal turmoil. Basil and his successors recognized that survival alone was not enough. Byzantium needed victories to secure its frontiers, restore prestige, and remind friend and foe alike that it remained the heir of Rome. One of the great challenges of the 9th century remained the Arabs. Their caliphates controlled vast territories, stretching from Spain to Persia. And though Byzantium had resisted complete conquest, the borderlands of Anatolia were subject to constant raiding. Every summer, Arab armies swept into Byzantine territory, plundering villages and testing fortresses. The Byzantines answered with counter-raids, pushing into Syria, Cilicia, and northern Mesopotamia. Here, the Byzantine army began to perfect a system of calculated offense. Generals such as Nicephorus Phocas and John Zimisces refined tactics that combined defensive resilience with devastating strikes. They understood that victory against the Arabs required patience, logistics, and the ability to sustain campaigns deep in hostile territory. Their soldiers, hardened by centuries of thematic defense, were now trained to march farther, fight longer, and siege with relentless determination. The Byzantines also innovated in military technology. The terrifying weapon of Greek fire, first used against Arab fleets in the 7th century, remained a decisive advantage at sea. Arab chroniclers described with horror the burning liquid that clung to ships and men alike, impossible to extinguish, seeming almost alive. At sea, Greek fire ensured Byzantine naval dominance for centuries. On land, the empire invested in siege engines, fortified camps, and new armor designs, blending traditional cataphract cavalry with lighter units better suited to the mountains and deserts of the eastern frontier. The tide began to turn in the 10th century. Under the leadership of Nicephorus Phocas, who later became emperor, Byzantine armies launched deep offensives into Arab territory. In 960, he led a massive campaign to retake Crete, which had been in Arab hands for more than a century. The conquest was brutal, requiring prolonged siege warfare and savage fighting in the island's rugged terrain. But when Crete finally fell, it was a victory of enormous significance. Arab piracy in the Aegean was crippled, and the empire's control of its seas was restored. Phocas was not finished. He turned his attention eastward, campaigning in Cilicia and Syria. His forces stormed city after city, culminating in the capture of Aleppo in 962.
These victories marked a new era. The empire was no longer merely defending, but expanding, reclaiming lands once lost. His successor, John Timuscus, continued the momentum. In 969, he captured Antioch, one of Christianity's greatest cities, restoring it to Byzantine rule after centuries under Arab control. With Antioch secured, Byzantium reasserted itself as the dominant Christian power in the eastern Mediterranean. The Arab world, once ascendant, now found itself on the defensive. Yet if the Arabs were being beaten back, another enemy pressed hard from the north, the Bulgars. The Bulgarian state, founded in the late 7th century, had long been a thorn in Byzantium's side. By the 9th and 10th centuries, it had grown into a formidable kingdom under rulers like Simeon the Great. Simeon dreamed of supplanting Byzantium itself, calling himself Emperor of the Bulgarians and Romans, a direct challenge to Constantinople's authority.
His armies clashed repeatedly with Byzantine forces, winning victories and threatening the imperial heartland. The wars with Simeon were brutal, a reminder that Byzantium's greatest threats were not always distant, but could come from across the Balkan Mountains. Battles raged across Thrace, with sieges, raids, and counter-raids devastating the land. At times, the Byzantines suffered humiliating defeats, forced to buy peace with tribute. But the empire did not break. Even when Simeon's armies camped within sight of Constantinople's walls, the city held firm, its defenses unbreached. Over time, the balance shifted. After Simeon's death in 927, his successors lacked his ambition and strength. Byzantium regained the initiative, slowly tightening its grip on the Balkans. This struggle reached its climax under Basil II, known to history as the Bulgar Slayer. Ascending the throne in 976, Basil faced years of civil war and internal strife. But once he consolidated power, he turned his full attention to the Bulgars. His campaigns lasted decades, grinding wars of attrition that tested the endurance of both sides. Basil marched repeatedly into the Balkans, fighting battles, besieging fortresses, and wearing down Bulgar resistance. The decisive moment came in 1014 at the Battle of Clydion. Basil's forces trapped the Bulgar army in a mountain pass, annihilating them. Chroniclers claim that Basil ordered 15,000 prisoners blinded, sparing one in every 100 with a single eye to lead the rest home. When the Bulgar Tar Samuel saw his broken army return, he died of shock. Within a few years, Bulgaria was fully absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. This was more than a victory. It was a demonstration of Byzantine endurance and ruthlessness. For centuries, the Bulgars had been an existential threat. Now they were gone, their lands incorporated into the empire, their power shattered. Byzantium had reasserted its dominance in the Balkans, securing its northern frontier. Under the Macedonian emperors, the Byzantine army became not only a force of defense, but of conquest. Its structure had matured, balancing the thematic resilience with elite tagmata, professional regiments stationed near Constantinople and deployed as the emperor's strike force. Its generals were masters of combined arms, blending heavy cavalry, infantry, and archers in coordinated maneuvers. Its navy controlled the seas, ensuring supply lines and punishing enemies with Greek fire. At its height in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Byzantine military was arguably the most advanced and disciplined in the world. It could defend against nomads in the steppe, crush enemies in the Balkans, and wage campaigns deep into the Middle East. It was the product of centuries of adaptation, an army born in crisis, forged in survival, and perfected in triumph. Picture for a moment a campaign under Basil II. The army marches through the rugged passes of the Balkans, soldiers in long columns winding through forests and rivers. Scouts move ahead, watching for ambushes. Cataphracts ride at the center, their armor glinting in the sun, lances ready. Infantry march steadily, shields strapped to their backs, spears in hand. Behind them follow siege engines, ready to batter fortresses into submission. The emperor himself rides among them, stern, relentless, a man devoted entirely to war. This is no fragile remnant of Rome. This is a living empire, armed and unafraid. By the time Basil died in 1025, Byzantium stood at the height of its medieval power. Its armies were feared across the known world, its frontiers secured, its enemies humbled. The survival of the empire was no longer in question. Instead, it seemed poised for a new golden age. Yet, history rarely allows triumphs to last forever.
For all its brilliance, the Byzantine army would soon face new challenges, new enemies from the east who would test its adaptability once again. The Seljuk Turks were rising, masters of mounted archery and mobile warfare, and the empire's hard-won dominance was about to be challenged. When Basil II, the Bulgar slayer, died in 1025, the Byzantine Empire stood at its zenith. Its armies had secured victories from the Balkans to the Middle East, its frontiers were stable, and its reputation as the greatest military power of the age was unmatched. Yet, within a single generation, the empire's fortunes began to unravel. Basil had no children. His successors were weaker, more concerned with court intrigues than with maintaining the fearsome war machine he had built. The army, which had been disciplined and relentless under Basil, began to atrophy. Imperial administrators, eager to save money or enrich themselves, neglected the themes, reduced military spending, and relied increasingly on mercenaries rather than native soldiers. The great engine of Byzantine survival was starting to rust. Meanwhile, new threats emerged on every horizon. In the west, a new power stirred in Italy, the Normans. Descendants of Viking adventurers who had settled in Normandy, they were fierce warriors, masters of both cavalry and siege warfare. By the 11th century, they began carving out kingdoms in southern Italy, directly challenging Byzantine holdings there. Battles against the Normans were hard fought, and the Byzantines often found themselves outmatched by the ferocity of these new knights, whose shock cavalry charges could shatter even disciplined formations. But it was in the east that the greatest danger arose. Out of the steppes of Central Asia came the Seljuk Turks, a people who combined the mobility of nomadic horsemen with the fervor of Islam.
Their mounted archers were fast, elusive, and deadly, capable of harassing an enemy army into exhaustion before delivering a devastating blow. The Byzantines had fought horse archers before, the Huns, the Avars, the Bulgars, but the Seljuks brought something new. They were not merely raiders, they were empire builders, determined to claim Anatolia, the very heartland of Byzantium. At first, the Byzantines underestimated them. Armies were dispatched piecemeal, generals squabbled, and victories were rare. The Seljuks struck deeper and deeper into Anatolia, raiding cities and fortresses that had been safe for centuries. The once secure theme system began to crack as soldiers lost their farms or fled their posts under constant pressure. The crisis came to a head in 1071 at the fateful Battle of Manzikert. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes led a large army eastward to confront the Seljuks, determined to halt their advance once and for all. His force included not only Byzantine soldiers, but also mercenaries, Normans, Franks, Armenians, and even some Turkish auxiliaries. It was a diverse but fragile host, held together by pay rather than loyalty. On the other side stood Alp Arslan, the Seljuk Sultan, a brilliant commander who understood the strengths of his cavalry. The two armies met near the fortress of Manzikert in eastern Anatolia on a hot August day. From the beginning, things went wrong for the Byzantines. Miscommunication, treachery, and poor coordination plagued Romanos's army.
As the battle began, Seljuk horse archers swarmed around the Byzantine lines, loosing arrows and retreating before counterattacks could land. The Byzantines advanced, but the enemy refused to stand and fight, withdrawing in feigned retreat. Dust rose from the plain, confusion spread, and cohesion began to falter. By evening, Romanos ordered a withdrawal to regroup. It was then that disaster struck.
One of his commanders, Andronikos Doukas, betrayed him, abandoning the battlefield with his troops. Panic rippled through the Byzantine ranks. The Seljuks seized the moment, encircling the disorganized army. In the chaos, the Byzantine lines collapsed. Soldiers fled, mercenaries deserted, and the once proud imperial army dissolved into rout. Romanos himself was captured, a humiliation almost unthinkable for a Roman emperor. Alp Arslan, displaying magnanimity, treated him with respect and released him in exchange for peace. But the damage was done. The Byzantine army had been shattered, and Anatolia lay open to invasion. The consequences of Manzikert were catastrophic. In the years that followed, Turkish tribes poured into Anatolia, seizing towns, villages, and farmland. What had been the heart of Byzantine strength, its great reservoir of thematic soldiers, was irreparably weakened. The empire lost not only territory, but its military foundation. For centuries, the fields of Anatolia had sustained the Byzantine army. Now, those fields belonged to others. The empire reeled from the blow. Civil wars erupted as rival claimants to the throne fought over what remained. Mercenaries, once employed to bolster the army, now turned against their paymasters, carving out territories for themselves. Norman adventurers continued to seize Byzantine lands in Italy. The empire that had seemed so strong under Basil II now appeared on the verge of collapse. And yet, true to form, Byzantium did not die. Even in the wake of Manzikert, the empire managed to endure. It lost much of Anatolia, yes, but Constantinople still stood, its walls unbroken, its fleets still masters of the sea. The Byzantines still had resources, still had ingenuity, still had the capacity to adapt. The defeat at Manzikert marked not the end, but a transformation. The army that emerged from this disaster would be different, reshaped by necessity. It would lean even more heavily on mercenaries, allies, and diplomacy. It would no longer be the disciplined thematic force of Basil II, but it would continue to fight, to scheme, to survive. Yet the psychological scar of Manzikert never healed. For Byzantines, it was a reminder that even the greatest armies could crumble, that even emperors could fall captive. It became a symbol of decline, a moment when the empire's fate shifted irreversibly. And in its aftermath, a new chapter opened, one that would draw Western knights into the East under the banner of the cross. But that, dear listener, is a story for another night. For now, picture the battlefield of Manzikert as the sun sets. The plain is littered with broken shields, abandoned banners, and the bodies of soldiers who once believed themselves heirs of Rome. In the distance, Seljuk horsemen ride in triumph, their arrows gleaming in the fading light. And in a tent nearby, the Emperor of Byzantium sits in captivity, humbled but not destroyed. This image would haunt the empire for centuries, but it would not extinguish it. Byzantium still lived, wounded but breathing, and its armies would rise again. The dust of Manzikert had barely settled when the Byzantium Empire entered one of the darkest chapters of its long history. The defeat in 1071 had not merely broken an army, it had shattered the political and military balance upon which the empire had rested for centuries. Anatolia, the beating heart of Byzantium power, was now exposed. For centuries, it had provided soldiers, grain, and taxes. With its loss, the empire bled strength at every vein. Yet the battlefield alone did not seal Byzantium's fate.
What followed was perhaps more destructive: civil war.
Rival factions within Constantinople tore the empire apart from within, each seeking to seize the throne in the wake of Romanos IV's disgrace. Instead of rallying to rebuild, generals turned their swords against one another, magnates carved up provinces for themselves, and mercenaries changed sides depending on who could pay them more. Meanwhile, the Seljuk Turks pressed deeper into Anatolia. Tribal bands, known as Ghazis, spread across the plateau, founding towns, seizing farmland, and pushing Byzantine garrisons ever farther west. By the 1080s, much of central Anatolia had been transformed. What had once been Byzantine villages now echoed with the calls to prayer from new mosques. The empire, which had defended this land for centuries, suddenly found itself reduced to a narrow band of territory along the western coast. It was at this desperate moment that a new figure rose to power: Alexios I Komnenos. Crowned in 1081, Alexios inherited an empire on the brink of collapse. The treasury was empty, the army broken, and enemies circled like vultures. From the west came the Normans, led by Robert Guiscard, pressing into Byzantine holdings in the Balkans. From the north came the Pechenegs, fierce nomads raiding across the Danube. From the east, the Seljuks loomed, their power entrenched across Anatolia. Alexios understood that the old model of the Byzantine army, the themes of farmer soldiers tied to Anatolian land, was gone. Anatolia itself was gone. What remained were fragments: the imperial guard, remnants of the Tagmata, and bands of mercenaries from across the Mediterranean. If Byzantium was to survive, it would need to reinvent its military system once more. He began by relying heavily on mercenaries. Normans, Turks, Cumans, and Varangians all found service in his armies. The most famous of these were the Varangian Guard, composed largely of Norsemen and Anglo-Saxons who had fled England after the Norman conquest of 1066. Towering men wielding great axes, they became the emperor's bodyguard, fierce in loyalty and terrifying in battle. Yet mercenaries were costly, and Alexios struggled constantly to raise funds, confiscating church treasures, negotiating loans, and promising lands in exchange for service. Even with these efforts, the task was immense. In 1081, Alexios faced the Norman invasion in the Balkans. At Dyrrhachium, his forces met Robert Guiscard in a brutal battle. The Normans, with their heavily armored knights, smashed through the Byzantine lines, inflicting a crushing defeat. Constantinople itself trembled at the threat. But Alexios, resourceful as ever, did not collapse. He retreated, regrouped, and wove together alliances, eventually turning the tide. The Normans were harried by disease, rebellion at home, and Byzantine counterattacks. By 1085, the Norman threat receded, leaving the empire battered but alive. Yet the east remained a gaping wound. Anatolia could not be retaken with the resources Byzantium now possessed. The empire needed help that could only come from outside. And so Alexios made a decision that would alter the course of history. In 1095, he sent envoys to the west, appealing to the Pope and the princes of Europe for aid. Alexios's request was modest. He asked for mercenaries, trained knights, to help him push back the Turks and reclaim parts of Anatolia. But what he received was something far greater: the First Crusade. When Pope Urban II preached the Crusade at Clermont in 1095, he unleashed a tidal wave of enthusiasm across Europe. Tens of thousands of knights, peasants, and adventurers took up the cross, pledging to march east to liberate the Holy Land. For Alexios, this was both an opportunity and danger. He had asked for soldiers under his command. Instead, he was faced with entire armies of Westerners, bound not to him, but to God and the Pope. Still, Alexios seized the chance. As the Crusaders arrived in waves at Constantinople in 1096 and 1097, he negotiated oaths of loyalty. demanding that they swear to return any former Byzantine territory they recaptured. Some agreed grudgingly, others less so, but the arrangement gave Alexios a foothold. Together with the Crusaders, Byzantine forces pushed into Anatolia. Cities like Nicaea, once lost to the Turks, were retaken and restored to imperial control. For the Byzantine army, this moment was both revival and humiliation. Revival because with Western aid, territories in Asia Minor were regained. Humiliation because it was clear that Byzantium no longer commanded the strength to act alone. The sight of Frankish knights, armored giants whose charges could smash Seljuk lines, reminded Byzantine soldiers of their own decline. Once, the empire had taught the world the art of war. Now it depended on foreign aid. Yet Alexios was too shrewd to see only weakness. He used the Crusaders as tools, guiding them where he wished, providing supplies, and ensuring that key cities returned to Byzantine hands. When the Crusaders marched on to Antioch and Jerusalem, carving out their own kingdoms, Alexios had already regained a foothold in western Anatolia. It was not the restoration of Basil II's empire, but it was survival, and in Byzantium, survival was victory. The relationship between Byzantium and the Crusaders, however, was fraught with tension. The Western knights saw the Byzantines as effeminate, cunning, and untrustworthy. The Byzantines, in turn, viewed the Crusaders as brutish, undisciplined, and dangerously uncontrollable. Time and again, misunderstandings flared into open hostility. But in military terms, the Crusades reshaped the Byzantine army. Exposure to Western knights encouraged reforms in cavalry. Byzantine commanders adapted, blending their own traditions of cataphracts and horse archers with the shock tactics of Frankish heavy cavalry. The empire could never match the manpower of Europe, but it could absorb its techniques, just as it had once absorbed the skills of Persians, Huns, and Arabs. Through Alexios and his successors, the Komnenian dynasty rebuilt the army into a leaner, more professional force. It was no longer the vast thematic system of old, but a patchwork of imperial guard units, mercenary contingents, and provincial levies. What it lacked in numbers, it made up for in flexibility and leadership. Under Alexios' son, John II Komnenos, and grandson Manuel I Komnenos, Byzantine armies campaigned aggressively, retaking territories in Asia Minor, striking deep into the Balkans, and asserting imperial authority across the eastern Mediterranean. Still, the shadow of Manzikert lingered. Anatolia was never fully recovered. The Seljuks remained entrenched in the plateau, and the empire's reach extended only to its western edges. The Byzantine army could defend, could even strike boldly, but it could never again command the vast manpower base that had once sustained it. Yet the spirit of survival endured. In the 12th century, Byzantine armies marched with Crusaders, fought alongside Venetians, and clashed with Normans. They adapted, negotiated, and maneuvered in a world that was changing rapidly. The empire was no longer the unchallenged master of the East, but it was still alive, still formidable, still Roman in name and in determination. Picture Constantinople in this era. The Crusaders marched through its streets, their armor gleaming, their banners flying, while Byzantine soldiers watched from the walls, clad in lamellar armor, their curved swords and composite bows at their sides. Suspicion hangs heavy in the air, but necessity binds them together, for now, and this fragile alliance would define the next century of Byzantine military history, a partnership with the West that brought victories but also betrayals, leading ultimately to a catastrophe far greater than Manzikert. The Komnenian emperors had breathed new life into the Byzantine army. Under Alexios, John II, and Manuel I, the empire had clawed back territories, stabilized borders, and even projected power once again into the Crusader states, the Balkans, and southern Italy. Byzantine soldiers, though fewer than in ages past, still marched proudly behind imperial banners. Yet beneath the surface, all was not well. Byzantium's reliance on the West, particularly on the Crusaders and the Italian maritime republics, proved a double-edged sword. Venetian, Genoese, and Pisan fleets dominated trade in the eastern Mediterranean, and Byzantine emperors, desperate for ships, granted them trading privileges that eroded the empire's economic independence. Western knights, once welcomed as allies, increasingly saw the empire not as the bastion of Christendom, but as a decadent prize ripe for exploitation. The seeds of disaster were sown in distrust. Byzantines saw Latin crusaders as rough, arrogant barbarians, disrespectful of Greek tradition, quick to anger, and prone to violence. Crusaders, in turn, saw Byzantines as treacherous, effeminate schemers who cloaked cowardice in diplomacy. Every joint campaign, every negotiation seemed to deepen the gulf. The tension came to a head during the Second Crusade, 1147 to 1149. Western knights marching through Byzantine lands clashed with locals, looted villages, and accused the emperor of withholding aid. Later, during the Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192, Emperor Isaac II Angelos found himself dealing with Richard the Lionheart, whose arrogance and aggression shocked Constantinople. Though Byzantium survived these encounters, the sense of estrangement between East and West had become almost unbridgeable. And then came the Fourth Crusade. Originally called in 1202 by Pope Innocent III, the Fourth Crusade was meant to strike at Egypt, then the heart of Muslim power in the Mediterranean. But from the beginning, things went awry. The Crusaders, unable to pay the Venetians for transport, were diverted to attack Christian cities as repayment. Zara, a fellow Christian city on the Adriatic, fell to them in 1202. Pope Innocent was outraged, but the momentum of greed and necessity carried the Crusaders onward. At this crucial moment, the Byzantine Empire itself was racked with internal strife. The Angelos dynasty had weakened the throne, and usurpations and court intrigues left Constantinople vulnerable. When the young prince Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed Isaac II, fled to the Crusaders, he offered them an irresistible bargain. If they would restore him to the throne, he would reward them with vast sums of gold, military aid for their crusade, and submission of the Byzantine Church to Rome. For the Crusader leaders, it was an opportunity too great to ignore. Instead of sailing to Egypt, they turned their ships toward Constantinople. In 1203, the Crusader army and Venetian fleet appeared before the walls of the city. The Byzantine defenders, unprepared and divided, could not withstand the assault. After fierce fighting, the Crusaders forced their way into the city, reinstating Isaac II and placing his son Alexios IV on the throne. But the promised rewards proved impossible. The imperial treasury was empty, the people of Constantinople resented their new Latin-backed rulers, and the alliance quickly soured. By early 1204, tensions had exploded. A coup inside the city toppled Alexios IV, and the Crusaders, enraged and unpaid, resolved to take what they had been denied. On April 12, 1204, the greatest Christian city in the world, capital of the empire that had called itself Roman for nearly 1,000 years, was stormed not by Turks or Persians, but by fellow Christians. The sack of Constantinople was one of the most brutal events in medieval history. For 3 days, Crusaders looted, burned, and desecrated. Churches were stripped of relics, icons were smashed, and the Hagia Sophia itself was defiled. Its altars overturned, its treasures stolen, its sacred spaces violated. Monasteries, palaces, and libraries were plundered. Priceless works of art, manuscripts, and holy relics were carted off to the west, many never to return. The Byzantine army, fractured and leaderless, could do little.
Soldiers who once defended the empire against Persians, Arabs, and Bulgars now found themselves powerless as their own capital fell to men who had sworn to protect Christendom. Some fought bravely in the streets, but the betrayal was too great, the assault too sudden, and resistance too scattered. For the Byzantine people, the shock was indescribable. To be conquered by Muslims had been a fear. To be betrayed by fellow Christians, to see Latin knights desecrate their holiest city, was a wound that never healed. Chroniclers wrote of atrocities, nuns violated, relics sold for trinkets, corpses left in the streets. The memory of 1204 poisoned relations between East and West for centuries, laying the groundwork for the deep schism that endures to this day. From the ashes of the sack, the Latin Empire of Constantinople was established, ruled by Western nobles. But it was a hollow creation, weak and unpopular. Byzantine aristocrats fled to found successor states, the Empire of Nicaea, the Despotate of Eborus, and the Empire of Trebizond.
In Nicaea, the Komnenoi and Laskarid dynasties rebuilt, gathering the remnants of the Byzantine army, training new soldiers, and plotting return. For the army, the years after 1204 were years of survival in exile. Stripped of Constantinople, cut off from much of its old territory, the Byzantine military shrank in size and prestige. Yet the core remained. In Nicaea, emperors trained new units, rebuilt fortresses, and kept alive the hope of restoration. They relied heavily on mercenaries, Turks, Cumans, and Latin knights, while nurturing a loyal core of Greek soldiers who clung to the dream of reclaiming their city. This dream was realized in 1261 when Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople, restoring the Byzantine Empire. But the empire that emerged from the Latin occupation was not the same. Its wealth was diminished, its population reduced, and its army far weaker. The Byzantines had regained their capital, but their days of imperial might were behind them. Still, the story of 1204 is not just one of tragedy. It is also a testament to Byzantine resilience. Even after the greatest city in Christendom was sacked, even after their empire was carved apart by Latins, the Byzantines did not vanish. Their army, fragmented and humbled, adapted yet again, finding ways to fight on. They endured humiliation, but they endured nonetheless. Picture, if you will, the ruins of Constantinople after the sack. The once glittering palaces lie blackened with soot. The Hagia Sophia, stripped of its treasures, echoes with silence. Latin banners fly over the walls, while Byzantine survivors wander in despair. Yet, beyond the Bosporus, in Nicaea, soldiers drill in dusty fields. They wear patched armor, carried battered shields, but their eyes burn with determination. They are the heirs of a broken empire, but not a dead one. For as long as the Byzantine army endured, there remained hope that the empire itself could rise again. And so it did, though never as it once had been. When Michael VIII Palaiologos entered Constantinople in 1261, he restored not just a city, but an empire. Yet the Constantinople he reclaimed was not the glittering jewel once hailed as the queen of cities. The Latin occupation had left scars, churches looted, palaces burned, neighborhoods emptied. Much of the population had fled or perished. What remained was a shell of former grandeur, surrounded by hostile powers and held together only by determination. The Byzantine army, too, was a shadow of what it had once been. Gone were the great tagmata of the Macedonian era, the disciplined Cataphracts of Basil II, the vast thematic armies of Anatolia. What remained was a patchwork of mercenaries, local militias, and a few elite guards. The empire had reclaimed its capital, but its resources were meager and its armies thin. Survival once again required ingenuity, diplomacy, and relentless adaptation.
Michael VIII tried to rebuild, but his reign was consumed by external threats. To the west, the Latin states carved from the wreckage of 1204 still clung to territory in Greece. To the north, the Bulgarians and Serbians sought to expand their influence in the Balkans. To the east, the rising power of the Turks, first the Seljuks, then their successors, pressed ever closer. Michael leaned heavily on diplomacy, securing alliances with Italian maritime republics when he could, and playing rival powers against one another. But he knew that diplomacy alone would not suffice. The army was reorganized as best as resources allowed. The Varangian Guard, still composed largely of Norse and now Anglo-Saxon exiles, continued to serve as the emperor's personal guard, their axes a reminder of old loyalties.
Mercenaries filled the ranks. Catalans from Spain, Turks from Anatolia, Latins from Italy. Yet reliance on mercenaries was risky. They were expensive, often disloyal, and could turn on their masters if unpaid. Still, Byzantium had little choice. Its native manpower base had been drained by centuries of war, plague, and depopulation. The most infamous example of this reliance came in the early 14th century, with the arrival of the Catalan Company. These mercenaries, hardened veterans of the Reconquista, were hired to fight the Turks in Asia Minor. At first, they were effective, winning victories and driving back Turkish raiders. But when disputes arose over pay and loyalty, the Catalans turned on their Byzantine employers. They ravaged the empire's lands, plundering cities and villages, and eventually carved out their own domain in Greece. For the Byzantines, the lesson was bitter. Mercenaries could save them, but they could also destroy them. Meanwhile, new threats emerged. In the Balkans, the Serbian Empire under Stefan Dušan rose to power in the mid-14th century, claiming dominance over Macedonia, Epirus, and Thessaly. Serbian armies marched deep into Byzantine territory, and Constantinople itself seemed threatened once more. In these years, the Byzantine army struggled to hold even the core provinces, relying on shifting alliances and the city's impregnable walls. But the greatest danger came from the east, where the fragmented Seljuk principalities gave birth to a new power, the Ottomans. Founded in the late 13th century by Osman I, the Ottomans were at first one of many Turkish beyliks in Anatolia. But their energy, leadership, and relentless expansion soon set them apart. By the early 14th century, they had crossed into Europe, seizing footholds in Thrace and the Balkans. The Byzantine army, once the terror of the East, now found itself on the defensive in its own backyard. Battles with the Ottomans revealed a stark contrast. The Ottomans fielded disciplined infantry, known as janissaries, and highly mobile cavalry, the sipahis, organized with efficiency and fueled by expansionist zeal. The Byzantines, by contrast, had only fragments of their old might, small units of native soldiers, mercenaries of uncertain loyalty, and the ever-dwindling Varangian Guard. Constantinople's walls remained unbroken, but the empire around them shrank year by year. Cities fell, provinces were lost, and the once vast revenues that had supported Byzantine armies dwindled to a trickle. Soldiers often went unpaid, and emperors turned increasingly to the west for aid. In exchange for promises of church union, emperors sought military assistance from the Pope and Catholic kingdoms. Yet aid was sporadic, often entangled in politics, and never enough to turn the tide. Still, the Byzantines endured. In the 14th and 15th centuries, they became masters of delaying tactics, using diplomacy to pit enemies against one another. They survived invasions by Serbians, Bulgarians, Turks, and even Mongol forces by carefully choosing when to fight and when to yield. The army, though small, retained a stubborn resilience. Garrisons held fortresses longer than expected, militias defended villages with desperate courage, and the city of Constantinople itself continued to defy the odds. But the pressure grew relentless. In 1453, the final storm broke. The Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, only 21 years old, gathered a massive army, perhaps 80,000 strong, supported by siege artillery the world had never seen. Among these weapons was a colossal cannon capable of hurling stone balls that shook Constantinople's ancient walls. Facing them were perhaps 7,000 defenders, Byzantines, Genoese allies, and the remnants of an empire that had once commanded the Mediterranean. The defenders manned the walls with grim determination, aware that they faced not just defeat, but annihilation. For weeks, they repelled assault after assault, Greek fire and desperate sorties holding back the tide. The emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, fought alongside his soldiers on the ramparts, a Roman emperor in the truest sense, refusing to flee even when offered escape. On May 29, 1453, the final assault came. Ottoman cannons shattered the walls, janissaries stormed the breaches, and the defenders were overwhelmed. Constantine XI vanished in the chaos, his body never definitively identified. The Byzantine army, small but valiant, was annihilated in its last stand. The fall of Constantinople marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, but not the end of its story. For nearly 1,000 years after the fall of Rome in the West, the Byzantine army had preserved the legacy of Roman discipline, strategy, and resilience. It had adapted to Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, Crusaders, and Turks. It had endured defeats that would have crushed other empires, rebounded from disasters that seemed final, and survived long enough to pass the torch of civilization to the Renaissance. And though Constantinople fell, the memory of its defenders endured. Chroniclers wrote of soldiers standing firm against impossible odds, of emperors fighting to the last breath, of walls that withstood centuries of siege. The Byzantine army may have perished in 1453, but its legacy lived on, in the tactics of European warfare, in the preserved manuscripts of Greek and Roman learning, and in the enduring idea that survival itself is a kind of victory. Imagine, as we close this long story, the walls of Constantinople one last time. The sun rises over the Bosporus, glinting off towers that have stood for 1,000 years. On the battlements, tired soldiers prepare for another day of defense. They know the odds, they know the end may come, but they take their place nonetheless. For that is what the Byzantine army always did. It endured. It stood when others fell. It carried the flame of Rome until the very last hour, when the torches were finally extinguished and the world moved on. But even in silence, the echo of their survival remains.